we're here for almost a holy purpose, and that's to honor those guys that are just down that road. And they can't talk to us, but they do speak to us, and we do hear them. And we help them let others remember, and that is what this is all about.
They had been pushed back 2 days ago. Their flanks had been hit the day before. Their lines had held, but they'd fought Lee many times. They know he isn't finished. But this was different. They believe this to be the decisive battle of the war. They are on their own soil. Many are from Pennsylvania. They must win. They are on enemy soil, but they believe their army to be invincible. Many have been lost in the numerous attacks over the past 2 days, but they have General Lee. He is more than their leader. He is their strength. They will attack again today. They're not used to losing. It is the 3rd of July, 1863. General Joseph Hooker was eating crow. He'd been placed in command of the Union Army of the Potomac earlier that year and had done much to improve morale. So much that when he left camp at the Rappahannock that spring, he touted, "May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." However, in May 1863, Lee's army of 60,000 handily defeated Hooker's 115,000 at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Lee's legendary ability was furthered there when he defied military theory by splitting his weaker command twice during the battle. Hooker was befuddled. Lincoln was fuming. my God, what will the country say?" exclaimed the president after hearing of the Union defeat. Lee had won a brilliant victory, but there had been costs. He'd lost 13,000 irreplaceable veterans and his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson. His talented corps commander was mistakenly shot one night while riding by a Confederate picket. It was a tragic blow for the Confederacy. The Confederacy had other problems in the West. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had stirred up trouble in Mississippi by defeating rebel forces in 5 straight battles in a push for Vicksburg, the key to control of the Mississippi River, the lifeline of the Confederacy. Grant's forces currently had the town under siege. The situation at Vicksburg had Lee and President Jefferson Davis's administration in Richmond understandably edgy. But Lee had a plan. If it worked, it would be a brilliant plan. With Hooker defeated and in camps around Fredericksburg, Virginia, Lee quickly began preparing. It was really quite simple. Lee would take the war into the North. He'd tried not a year earlier, only to be repelled at Antietam, Maryland. But now, with the Army of the Potomac again licking its wounds, the time was ripe. The Army of Northern Virginia would march to Pennsylvania, threaten Harrisburg, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and possibly Washington. The invasion would ease war-burdened Virginia, allowing farmers in the fertile Shenandoah Valley to have an uninterrupted harvest. It would also improve Southern morale, while at the same time fan the fire of the growing peace Democrats in the North. It might draw Grant away from Vicksburg, and finally, a successful invasion could bring on the European recognition of the Confederate States of America and possible intervention into the war. To be sure, it was a very risky venture. Lee's 70,000 troops would face their largest challenge, isolated, deep in enemy soil, living off of the countryside and heavily outnumbered. But Jefferson Davis thought these were risks worth taking. And by June 13, 1863, Lee's army was on the move north. The Confederates were moving fast. One rebel boasted that in a single day he'd tasted breakfast in Virginia, whiskey in Maryland, and supper in Pennsylvania. Lincoln was furious. Upon learning of Lee's departure, Hooker had intended to attack Richmond. Old Abe shot back that the objective is not the Confederate capital, it is Lee's army. Though outnumbering Lee by roughly 40,000 troops, Hooker followed the avenue chosen by so many of his predecessors as commander of the largest Union army in the country. He hesitated and overestimated the rebel strength, pestering Washington for reinforcements and finally stripping the capital of its defenders. On June 13th, Hooker finally moved from his camps at Fredericksburg, marching north through the old battlefields at Manassas toward Frederick, Maryland. He was shadowing Lee's army, which was moving through the Shenandoah Valley across the Potomac into Pennsylvania's rich Cumberland Valley farmland. Hooker moved cautiously, keeping his army between Lee and Washington. At times, the Union Army of the Potomac was closer to Richmond than Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lincoln had pressed Hooker to hit Lee as he was strung out in the Shenandoah Valley. Hooker, unsure of himself and Lee's strength, never pursued the matter. Lee's army moved in 3 recently organized corps. The lead element was the 2nd Corps, Stonewall Jackson's former troops, under the command of Richard S. Ewell. He had lost a leg at Second Bull Run and had been absent from the army for 9 months. They were followed by the 3rd Corps, led by newly appointed Corps Commander Ambrose Powell Hill, a tenacious fighter who at times tended to attack without orders. Lee's old warhorse, Pete Longstreet, led the 1st Corps. A brilliant defensive tactician ahead of his time, Longstreet agreed to the invasion if it was kept defensive in nature, forcing the Union Army to fight only when the Confederates were in a strong position, a situation that would never arise. Lee's Confederates moved boldly north, swatting Union forces along the route. Ewell captured a Federal garrison at Winchester and Stevenson's Depot. Their sights were set on the rich Dutch farmland of Pennsylvania. Of course, the farmers would be paid in full Confederate scrip for their crops, assured the rebels, right after the smashing victory in Pennsylvania. Free blacks were gathered to be sent back to slavery. Lee made no objections. Yet the troops were on strict orders not to pillage or burn. The Pennsylvania civilians were at once fascinated and appalled. One man wrote of the rebels crowding his town's streets. Most of the men were exceedingly dirty, some ragged, some without shoes. The air was filled with the filthy exhalations from their bodies. But we do not intend to reproach them for not presenting a better appearance. They doubtless did the best they could and had come a long journey for the express purpose of supplying their pressing wants. One rebel from Texas, when confronted with a young northern lady boldly displaying the American flag on her chest, saucily commented, "Madam, you're doing a very dangerous thing. We rebels never see that flag flying over breastworks without charging them." Confederate morale was definitely at a high mark. The victories of 1862 and the Great Battle of Chancellorsville this year had led us to believe scarcely anything impossible to Lee's army. We were veterans thoroughly experienced in all that relates to march or the battlefield. Lee in himself was a tower of strength, wrote one Confederate. Their Union foe, also on the march north, were equally inspired. The rebels were invading northern soil. The men knew no limit to their enthusiasm. "We can whip them on our own soil," said they. "There is no man who cannot fight the better when it is for his own home." Such expressions passed from lip to lip as the dark column pushed on. Lee was moving like a blind man. His eyes and ears, the renowned Confederate cavalry under General Jeb Stuart, had been gone for days. Lee had heard nothing from them. Instead of reporting on the position and movement of the Army of the Potomac, Stuart was joyriding. He'd had his reputation tarnished at Brandy Station, Virginia, a few weeks back when Union cavalry had surprised him, bringing about the largest mounted engagement this continent had ever known, with 21,000 Federal and Confederate troopers involved. Though Stuart's forces finally drove the attackers, the Union cavalry had fought well. Stuart felt he must redeem himself. Interpreting his own designs into Lee's orders, he would ride entirely around the Union Army, causing panic, wrecking supply lines, and getting newspaper headlines, but never would he contact Lee. Stuart would be gone for 8 days, and Lee would be forced to act on the information of a spy. On June 28th, Lee was headquartered with Generals Hill and Longstreet at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. The spy found them there. His name was Harrison, and Longstreet had used him with success before. He didn't let them down. Yes, the Army of the Potomac was on the move. Harrison had been to Frederick, Maryland only a day or so before. They were there in force. And by the way, Harrison added nonchalantly before departing, Hooker is no longer in command. Some new fellow. Meade's the name. It was true. Fighting Joe Hooker had been relieved, and Lincoln had named his 7th commander of the Army of the Potomac. Major General George Gordon Meade, the Pennsylvanian, got the nod. "He will fight well on his own dunghill," Lincoln commented. Meade had been an able corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. The sour, often irritable general was finally referred to by an aide as a damned old, goggle-eyed, snapping turtle. General Lee respected the choice. "Meade will commit no blunder in front, and if I make one, he will make haste to take advantage of it." Meade didn't wait around. On June 29th, one day after receiving command of the Army of the Potomac, he had it moving north behind a large screen of cavalry. The tough Union veterans were pushed to the limits of their endurance. One soldier remembered, "Regiments became like companies. Companies lost their identity. Men were dying with sunstroke, and still the march continued." With information of a Union army within a couple of days' march, Lee began recalling his troops. Elements of Ewell's corps had reached the outskirts of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the northernmost point ever reached by a rebel force. But Lee's army was dangerously spread over an arc of roughly 70 miles. It must be concentrated, and Gettysburg, with roads fanning in every direction like the spokes of a wheel, was the perfect place to do it. Lee had intended upon fighting at Cashtown. His troops were currently on the road for a rendezvous there. Gettysburg would act as the hub of this concentration. For many of the same reasons, Meade was also attracted to the town. He had 1/3 of his army en route there. Leading the contingent was a division of troopers under the command of an old Indian fighter. His name was John Buford. At Gettysburg, fate would have the role in determining matters. At times, it would control things more than any general on the field. And inevitably, it would draw thousands to an unknown crossroads town that would forever after hold the nation's, and for a time, the world's attention. There was a shoe factory in Gettysburg. On June 30th, a brigade of Confederates, many shoeless, went into town for a well-needed visit. A column of Federal cavalrymen, Buford's men, on a distant road, convinced them to turn around. Lee had issued strict orders not to bring upon a major conflict. Only Hill's corps was on the field. Ewell and Longstreet's troops were still miles away on the roads, but the ever-confident Hill shrugged the bluecoats off as mere militia. When one of his division commanders, General Henry Heath, asked if there were any objections to taking the division into town on the morning of July 1st to get those shoes, Hill responded, "None in the world." But Buford's division of troopers weren't militia, and an entire corps of Federal infantry was a few hours away. That night, a Federal brigadier boasted that they could easily beat any force the rebels threw at them. Buford silenced the man with this prediction: "They will attack you in the morning, and they will come booming, skirmishers 3 deep. You will have to fight like the devil until supports arrive." Buford had called it correctly. By first light on the morning of July 1st, pickets were streaming back to the Federal lines west of Gettysburg before a Confederate skirmish line 1.5 miles long. The Federal troopers numbered about 2,400, with every fourth man holding the reins of 4 horses. Heath's attacking Confederates were roughly 7,400. Buford sent an urgent appeal to John Reynolds' 1st Corps, the lead infantry element of Meade's army, to hurry. Meanwhile, Heath's lean infantrymen advanced. Shoes were their prize, and a few bandbox cavalrymen weren't going to stop them. But they did stop them. The troopers would keep the rebels in check for roughly 60 minutes. It would be just enough time. The 1st Corps had been on the Taneytown Road since before dawn. It was led by Major General John Reynolds, not only a well-respected West Point professional, but a Pennsylvanian. He had ridden ahead of his troops, conferred with Buford, and sent a courier with a message to Meade at Taneytown. "The enemy is advancing in force. I will fight him inch by inch, and if driven into the town, I will barricade the streets and hold him there as long as possible." Reynolds would never get the chance. He would be dead before noon. At the head of Reynolds' column marched Brigadier General James Wadsworth's 1st Division, and in it contained Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade, so called because of its excellent reputation under fire. Buford's weary troopers had bought the time they needed. Ahead, one of Heath's Confederate brigades, that of James Archer, hurried unknowingly right in the Iron Brigade's direction. They marched recklessly into Farmer McPherson's woods, thinking they only faced a handful of cavalry. But a withering return fire and the distinctive black hats of the Iron Brigade to their front proved otherwise. The rebels cried, "There are those damned black-hatted fellows again. 'Tain't no militia, it's the Army of the Potomac." Reynolds was in the midst of the Iron Brigade charge, directing regiments personally when a Confederate sniper found him. The minie-ball killed him instantly. His death would be mourned throughout the Army. Meanwhile, the Iron Brigade had turned Archer's flank and the Confederates were reeling. Brigadier General Archer himself was captured. The situation was reversed on the Union right. Cutler's Federals had been flanked themselves. Wadsworth had ordered these troops, positioned north of the Chambersburg Pike, to pull out. Most units heard the order. A New York regiment didn't and were left alone in the face of an entire rebel brigade. To their fellow New Yorkers' aid came the red-trousered 95th New York and the 14th Brooklyn. They began to pound the flank of Davis's charging butternuts. Heath's Confederates could take no more. Many would retreat into the cover of a nearby railroad cut where they would be trapped. One brigade lost over half its men, most as prisoners. Heath glumly wrote later that the enemy had now been felt and found to be in heavy force in and around Gettysburg. Around noon, advance elements of Major General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps arrived. A Gettysburg civilian described the sight as a splendid vision of high courage and eager hope. Howard also found that with Reynolds dead, he was now the senior commander on the field. Confederate reinforcements were choking the hot, dusty roads as well. A.P. Hill had Dorsey Pender's division moving up to support Heath from the west, and soon the Federals would face a new threat from the north. Ewell had the divisions of Jubal Early and Robert Rhodes heading south toward Gettysburg. Lee warned Ewell that a full engagement must not be brought on until the entire Army of Northern Virginia was on the field. Longstreet's 21,000 veterans were still a long way off, but Ewell was no Stonewall Jackson, and Lee, used to his former daring and ingenious corps commander, continued to make suggestions rather than give orders. It was a habit that would cost him dearly over the next few days. Whether Lee liked it or not, by mid-afternoon this little search for shoes was snowballing. By 2 o'clock, 2 full Federal corps were on the field, roughly 20,000 men. About the same time, Ewell's lead division, Rhodes's, entered the field north of Gettysburg and launched an incredibly reckless attack, without bothering to post skirmishers, into elements of Howard's 11th Corps. The rebels ran into a wall of musket fire. A New York captain wrote that the Confederate line staggered, halted, and was swept back as by an irresistible current. One of Rhodes' brigades, Daniels, hit a Federal brigade known as the Bucktails, due to the deer tails they wore on their caps. In a seesaw fight, the Confederates were held in check. The cost? Nearly 2/3 of the Bucktails lay killed and wounded. By 4 o'clock, the Union line was being driven by the Confederates along its entire front. Early's division had arrived and helped Rhodes attack from the north, and Heath and Pender attacked from the west. Lee had also arrived on the battlefield. Though he'd hesitated against a full engagement without Longstreet, the opportunity here was too sweet. 2 entire Federal corps at a right angle to each other. Rebel pressure from all sides could pinch their lines like the closing of a jackknife. It was only the first day. Neither side was at full strength, but the carnage already rivaled past battles. Union General Carl Schurz described it: regiment stood against regiment in the open fields, near enough to almost see the white in another's eyes, firing literally into one another's faces. The slaughter on both sides was awful. The pressure was too great. The Federal boys began streaming back through Gettysburg. Almost 5,000 would be taken prisoner. But the Confederates failed to, as Lee would later put it, gather the fruits of victory. Even a town local noticed. While the rebels were halting, resting, and rejoicing, the 1st and 11th Corps fell back upon Cemetery and Culp's Hills undisturbed in obtaining these strong positions. The enemy did not go on the flood tide that leads to fortune. But the boys in blue had paid dearly. A northern newspaper correspondent lamented, "Reynolds, the beloved and the brave, was dead. The men of the 1st Corps alone could in few instances turn to speak to the ones who stood beside them in the morning without meeting with a vacant space. The havoc in that corps was so frightful as to decimate it fully one half, and that in the 11th Corps was scarcely less great." The retreating Federals were met on the heights outside Gettysburg with a new kind of inspiration, a man who people felt safe around, Winfield Scott Hancock. Meade had thoughtfully rushed him to the battlefield upon hearing of Reynolds' death. He was in command and helped restore order and security amidst the dazed Federals. Lee had wanted the attack renewed, but Hill's troops were tired and lacked ammunition, and Ewell simply waited. And the chance to push and possibly beat the Federals died away as 2 fresh corps began flooding the Union lines. By dawn, Meade had arrived and had some 85,000 troops in a line that ran in a fishhook along Cemetery Ridge. Lee's 65,000 Confederates lined Seminary Ridge and wrapped around Gettysburg for about 5 miles. The Federal line was bookended between 2 rises, Cemetery and Culp's Hills on their right, and the Round Tops on their left. Today, Lee would attack them both. Meade's was a good position. His lines were short. Reinforcements from his right could make it to his left within half an hour, an asset that would come in very handy this afternoon. The day began quietly. Most of Longstreet's 1st Corps began arriving early that morning and were still streaming in. They would go to work immediately. Lee wanted them to attack Meade's left flank. Pickett's division wouldn't arrive until late in the afternoon. Longstreet, with only 2 of his 3 divisions on the field, grumped, "I never like to go into battle with one boot off." Despite this and other strategic disagreements with General Lee, Longstreet, ever a good soldier, began to move into position. Lee's plan was a Confederate trademark, an echelon attack. One brigade after another, moving right to left, would pound the Federal line amidst the Round Tops. Ewell was to keep the Federal right occupied and possibly launch a full-scale attack at his discretion. If successful, Longstreet would roll up the entire Federal line. But successful echelon attacks require good timing and thorough coordination, 2 things the Confederates wouldn't have much of today. They would have help that could get them very close to their goal, and ironically, it would come from a general on the other side of the field. Anchoring the Federal left was the 3rd Corps commanded by Major General Dan Sickles, a former politician known for killing his wife's lover and getting away with it. That afternoon, without orders, he'd advanced his entire 10,000-man corps a half-mile forward of the Federal line. They were now deployed in an inverted V. No contact was made with the 2nd Corps on his right, and the left flank of the Army of the Potomac hung literally in the air. It would almost cost the Federals the battle. Meanwhile, Lee had problems of his own. It took Longstreet 3.5 hours to get his troops into position, and General Stuart and his troopers had finally arrived. After a brief tongue-lashing, Lee gently told him, "We'll discuss this matter no further. Now help me fight these people." Yet Stuart would prove no help in the coming battle. Meade had been strengthening his lines all night. He didn't expect an attack on his left, and he couldn't have expected Sickles' amateur deployment. Meade personally rode to confer with Sickles, who offered to pull back, but he was too late. The rebel attack had begun in earnest. It was late in the afternoon, but the Confederates made up for lost daylight with fierce initial assaults. John Hood's division of Texans, Alabamans, and Georgians quickly began to envelop the Federal left. But General Warren, Meade's chief engineer, had Vincent's brigade en route to secure the Round Tops. This fight would create a legend out of one small Federal regiment, the 20th Maine. They would keep the entire left flank of the Army of the Potomac from destruction. By 5:30, Hood's assault was winding down, and Longstreet continued the echelon attack with the brigades of McLaws' division. The fighting in Sickles' front soon reached a frenzied pitch. One Confederate wrote, "The balls were whizzing so thick that it looked like a man could hold out a hat and catch it full." The Federal situation had gotten desperate. Hood had turned the left of Sickles' 3rd Corps, and McLaws was beginning to break its center. Sickles had been carried from the field coolly smoking a cigar, his right leg shattered. It would later be amputated. Meade was again forced to call upon Hancock, giving him command of the entire Federal left flank. In what soldiers would simply refer to as the wheat field, the Federals were hit by a strong Confederate assault. A Union officer wrote of his troops, "It seemed to me that nearly half were struck down. It remained to be seen how long the other half would hold out." Kershaw's South Carolinians and Semmes' Georgians put up a ruthless fight. The Federal line began to give way, but the oncoming rebels hit the fresh Federal brigades of Brigadier General John Caldwell's division, who were trying to secure the Union line from Devil's Den to the wheat field. One after another, the Blue Brigades marched piecemeal into the deadly fray. Caldwell's division contained Colonel Patrick Kelly's Irish Brigade. They attacked with the words of their brigade chaplain ringing in their ears. "The Catholic Church refuses Christian burial to the soldier who turns his back upon the foe." The wheat field would change hands 6 times before a fresh Federal division of Pennsylvanians would finally secure it. Ewell hadn't launched his attack, so Meade had used the time bought by able field commanders to move reinforcements from the quiet Federal right flank. All afternoon long, the Confederates would strike portions of the Federal line, reinforced only minutes before being hit. Meanwhile, Anderson's division of A.P. Hill's Corps continued the echelon attack. An Alabama brigade headed for a gap created by Union troops reinforcing the wheat field. Hancock had supporting Federals on the way, but he needed 5 minutes. He got the time from one undersized regiment. Hancock ordered the 1st Minnesota to attack an entire Confederate brigade. A Minnesota officer recalled, "Every man realized in an instant what that order meant. Death or wounds to us all, the sacrifice of the regiment to gain a few minutes' time and save the position."
What Hancock said, boys. We bought some time.
The reinforcements were able to fill the gap. The 1st Minnesota had given Hancock his 5 minutes, but at a huge expense. Of the 262 men who went in, only 47 walked away. 82% were killed or wounded, the highest percentage of any Union regiment in the war. By 8 p.m., the Confederate attacks on the Union left had died out. Ewell had been inactive all day, allowing Meade to pull troops from his right to bolster his left. Ewell would launch an uncoordinated attack later that night, only to be repulsed from Federals heavily entrenched. Late that afternoon, 4,500 men of Major General George Pickett's division arrived 4 miles west of Gettysburg. They hadn't seen much action in the past year and had most recently been guarding Lee's supply trains. As night fell, Pickett worried that his boys wouldn't be in the coming fight. He needn't have. General Lee had large plans for Pickett's division. They bivouacked that night amidst the sounds of thousands of wounded lying in sites of ghastly destruction: the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and the wheat field. They had survived, but the battle was far from over. Tomorrow, the names of new horrible battle sites would forever be etched in their memory, and for thousands more, these places would be their last. The day began early for the boys in gray along the Confederate left flank. By dawn, a full-scale fight had evolved upon Culp's Hill, and the Federals had brought it on. The Union 12th Corps had attacked trenches lost in the rebel assaults the night before. But Johnson's rebels had been reinforced, and a close quarters battle raged for most of the morning. The battle ended as a Federal countercharge forced a Confederate retreat. This fight, amidst Farmer Culp's forest, would be Ewell's last at Gettysburg. Despite the ferocity and loss of life, it would be overshadowed by the afternoon's pending events. Meade had predicted it the night before. He forewarned General John Gibbon, whose division was placed in the Federal center, "If Lee attacks tomorrow, it will be on your front. He has made attacks on both our flanks and failed, and if he concludes to try it again, it will be on our center." Exactly what Lee had in mind. After artillery softened the Federal line, Pickett's division, 4 brigades from Pender's and Anderson's divisions, and Heath's battle-scarred division, roughly 15,000 men, would aim for a cluster of trees on Cemetery Ridge near the center of the Union line. Longstreet disagreed with Lee's plan. "General, I have been a soldier all my life. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Lee, who was suffering from the heart disease that would eventually kill him, ignored the warning. By 11 a.m., a lull had settled over the battlefield. The temperature was a humid 90 degrees. The soldiers created shade and struggled to keep the pending battle off of their minds. But these were veterans, and amidst the song and joke was the knowledge that many wouldn't survive the day.
And it must be now his kingdom's coming in the year of jubilo. One way to put he weighs 300 pounds. His coat so big it couldn't pay a tailor, and it won't go halfway round. He drills them as they call him.
Around 1 p.m., it began. First, a single gun. Then, a roar. The Confederate bombardment was supervised by Colonel E. Porter Alexander, the same artilleryman who'd effectively pounded Sickles' retreating Federals the day before. His 170 guns had started one of the largest cannonades ever. Frank Haskell, an aide to Union General Gibbon, wrote of the terrible shelling. To say that it was like a summer storm with the crash of thunder, the glare of lightning, the shrieking of the wind, and the clatter of hailstones would be weak. Many of the shots passed over the Federal lines, causing havoc amidst the supply trains, Meade's headquarters, and amongst the Union batteries. The Federals responded with accuracy, pounding the infantry waiting in woods behind the Confederate lines. The Federal return fire began to ebb. Some Federal guns were pulled off of the ridge, and Colonel Alexander fell into a trap. The Union artillery chief, Henry Hunt, had ordered a ceasefire to conserve ammunition and to lure the Confederates out early for the attack everyone knew was coming. Alexander took the bait and penned a note to Pickett. "The 18 guns have been driven off. For God's sake, come quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition nearly out." Pickett took the note to Longstreet, who glumly bowed his head in affirmation. A few minutes later, Longstreet told Alexander, "I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it now, but that General Lee has ordered it and expects it." Around 3 p.m., Confederates came out of the woods with Pickett's cry, "Don't forget today that you are from old Virginia." They advanced with orders not to yell nor fire. One Northern officer described it as the most beautiful thing I ever saw. The Union guns began firing again, ripping huge gaps in the butternut lines. "We could not help from hitting them at every shot," a Union witness recalled. But the Confederates pressed on, redressing their lines as if on parade. They advanced amidst the Union chants of "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg," where last December the roles had been reversed as Union boys made an unsuccessful, bloody assault against a well-defended line of Lee's troops. The rebels were aiming for a group of trees roughly in the center of Hancock's Second Corps. Federal brigades who'd waited patiently for the rebels to get into effective musket range began horrendous volleys. A Federal officer remembered, "Arms, heads, blankets, guns, and knapsacks were tossed into the clear air. A roar went up from the field, distinctly to be heard amid the storm of battle." Quick-thinking field commanders on both of the rebel flanks wheeled their Federals to enfilade the oncoming horde. The rebel brigades began to push to the center, intermingling to avoid the fire on their flanks. The Federal line formed a crook just to the right of the group of trees. Troops would call it the angle. It was lined with Pennsylvania troops, steadily firing as if each of their homes lay just to the other side of the wall. One of Pickett's brigadiers, Richard Garnett, unable to walk, was the only field commander allowed to ride. He had something to prove, and he did it with his life. He died at the head of his brigade, refuting once and for all the charges of cowardice brought upon him by Stonewall Jackson. Brigadier General Lou Armistead, using his hat as a guidon, marched against one of his best friends in the world, Winfield Scott Hancock. Before the war, the two had parted with Armistead, saying that if he ever raised a hand against his friend, may God strike him down. His omen would be granted as he led his North Carolinians inside the angle. In places, the Union line began to break. Officers tried to rally their men. The 71st Pennsylvania had begun to give way when a volley from the 72nd Pennsylvania withered the rebel advance. The 19th Massachusetts and 42nd New York entered the fight, charging directly for the rebels in the angle. Foot to foot, body to body, and man to man, they struggled, pushed, and strived, and killed, a Massachusetts soldier recounted. The rebels wisely began to fall back. Union officers tried to rally their men to pursue, but the boys in blue were too weary and disorganized. The rebels limped back to the cover of their lines. The greatest assault of the war was over. It had cost Lee over 6,500 men, and it had gained him nothing. He took the blame completely and would later offer his resignation to Jefferson Davis. Davis would decline it. Gettysburg was the bloodiest 3 days of the war. Almost a third of all engaged, 51,000, were lost. The North could refill their ranks, but Lee's 28,000 casualties would never be replaced. The Army of Northern Virginia pulled out that afternoon amidst a summer downpour. Meade chose not to follow. Word came that Vicksburg had fallen. The Mississippi River was in Union hands, and Lee's army was shattered and limping home. Independence Day was celebrated in the North. There were no celebrations ahead of Lee's troops. This day, instead, would mark the beginning of the end of Southern independence.
So how long have you been reenacting?
32 years reenacting.
And your name is?
I'm Ripley Robinson from Midland, Virginia. And it's important that we teach, all of us reenactors, teach the coming generations what really went on. The schools are not doing it. It's up to us to do it.
I like the overnight camping, and I like to spend the night with other people because they're my friends. And you meet a lot of new people, and you get to dress up, and that's fun. And I especially like to dance.
She's saving me a waltz.
There's lots of other people who like to be reenactors because they look at us and they're like, Mom, can I be a reenactor when I get older or something like that?
My name is Robert C. Moats, and I live in Chesterfield County, Virginia. Run a sporting goods store. Well, actually, I've been doing it for over 30 years. It's become more and more authentic. I think that's the main thing. So I think it's improved.
You think that's important?
Well, of course, the authenticity is one of the basic reasons why we're here, I think, is to create the impression for other people, you know, that are not familiar with the war between the states, the impression that they were there, perhaps, or, you know, got a sense of being there. And authenticity certainly helps in creating that impression.
And it's good to see that, you know, people our age are interested in other things besides MTV and things.
Yeah, but MTV is cool.
I was never a history buff until I started reenacting, and it's encouraged me to read more and to learn more about it.
I had a great-great-grandfather who was a captain of the 9th Tennessee, and you know, I just thought I had the heritage and the blood in me, so he did this for 4 years. I could come out and at least do it for a weekend.
I'm originally from Gettysburg. My family's been here for 13 generations, and I'm a descendant of the Cadoris, whose farm was in the middle of Pickett's charge. And when I met the unit during the 125th, and for my family, for me to put on a gray coat was probably one of the hardest things for them to ever understand. But for me, it was kind of doing the flip side of history and trying to learn another side. And just as Jerry said, you know, I was born here, and anything I ever knew was really Yankee, and so I finally had a chance to learn another side and learn about the Southern heritage. And for me, it kind of turned full circle, because it wasn't until after I got into this I found out that the unit that I joined was the unit that fought out of the back of the Cadore farm.
Last year, both of us had an opportunity to work on the Killer Angels production. He was out here from pre-production time to the last film day, and I worked with craft services for 4 weeks also. So we had a good time, made a lot of wonderful friends, and that was basically why we came out here, to see all the friends we made over here.
And I live in Baltimore now. I'm in Scotland originally.
So what are you doing here?
That's a very good question. I've been asking myself that for about 24 hours. Well, you see, just over 3 years ago, my girlfriend and I went down to the 125th anniversary of Appomattox, just for something to do for a long weekend. And it was her idea, it wasn't even my idea. And we took one look.
I guess we're all just
boys trapped in men's bodies.
This is the 21st Ohio doing the bagpipes. Boys, are you ready?
Shoot my colonel, my Johnny Rebel colonel. I just don't think I understand. And if you shoot a colonel, a North Carolina colonel, we'll have to bury him in Dixieland. He leads us into battle, our muskets start to rattle, our flags are flapping in the air. And when he sees them Yankees shooting Henry rifles, he says, boys, we're going over there. On his staff he has some helpers, some slackers and some yelpers. There was Johnny Good and Captain Potts. And then there's Major Bull, who called all the fuss. But old Colonel Henry gets a hot. Come on! Don't shoot my sergeant, my big old fat first sergeant. I just don't think I'll understand. And if you shoot my sergeant, my big old fat first sergeant, we'll have to bury him in Dixieland.
What's that?
Where'd you come in from?
Muncie, PA.
Where?
Muncie, Wilkes-Barre area.
Muncie. Good try.
Yeah.
So what do you think? You guys ready for the event?
Oh, it's gonna be great. Incredible. Gonna be incredible. I got out of the hospital to do this.
What's it been like all day?
It's been crazy is what it's been like, but it's been fun.
How did you get into this duty?
Sergeant asked me to do it. Sergeant asked you to do it, you just go and do it. You don't ask twice. So, but you know, I'm glad to help out. A lot of men are coming in right now, getting out of work, and you just want them to be a part of it and have a good time. So they just got to come in, get their gear out, and get ready to have some fun.
We started doing this because marching out there was too much like work, and
But the most important thing I noticed when I was reenacting was there was nothing on food. They brought the cans of beef stew, or they might go out for pizza or something like that, but they never ate like they should have in the field. So I started doing some research and figured it was very easy to cook outside, and we started gathering plots together and we just do it. Company mess of 1863, 64, and we feed units from New Jersey to Maine. We feed anybody who want to eat with us, up to 300.
Now, from a reenactor standpoint, what's the cost for something like that for the weekend?
For 5 meals, we charge them $11.
$11 a meal?
No, $11 for the weekend. Well,
You'll eat anything.
Try one, Shane.
This is great.
Monetarily, yeah, oh, lots. We've got thousands of dollars because there's 3 of us in the hobby. My husband, my son, and I. So we all got our own clothes, his equipment that he uses because he does sometimes both sides. Does Confederate and Union Federals.
Just like Thursday, you know, just went around the actual battlefield and stuff, check that out so we can, you know, get out here and actually have a sense of what we're doing rather than be like cowboys running around with guns and stuff. Gives you more of a purpose. You know, whatever we do, we can't really, you know, be completely accurate, but if you can get like one sense of smell or something like might have been back there, then it's all worth it, I guess.
When you first get into this hobby, it's fun, and you want to blow the powder and, you know, that kind of things. After a while, you begin to want to talk to people, keep the history going, and explain things that they're not aware of. So I'd rather do that than I would go out on the battlefield. What I would like to see them get out of it is impossible to do, and that's recreate the battle, because we can only give them a small speck of what a battle would actually look like. You know, the bodies are not tore all to pieces, the horses are not dead laying on the grounds, the wagons are not blown up, and accoutrements and guns and everything laying all over the place, so we can't give them that. But what we can give them is a small idea of what it looked like, and then a lot of explanation afterwards.
No telephones?
Yeah, there's no telephones, there's nothing around the house saying, you know, I've got this to do or do this or do that. It gives me the opportunity to just sit back and relax and to maybe do some reading and research on the hobby and sewing. I love to sew, so I get a chance to sew, and just sitting around talking to people. You know, you don't always get a chance to do that in your jobs and your everyday life. And with this hobby, you're forced to do it, and it's very relaxing.
I can't think of anything else I'd rather do. Sit here in the rain, trying to keep dry, and be with my friends.
I think these are the best friends I've ever made anywhere, in any form of business or pleasure or atmosphere. These people stick by you. They're just needed when you need them. You know, they're there for you. If you got to move or something, they're there. They're good folks, yeah.
What do you think about all these guys in this group?
Do you love us, Caroline?
Why do you love them?
Because you're my friends.
Step in, everybody, round to the back. Make that bridge nice and tall. Everybody through. Both lines in, bow and curtsy. Right hand around. Left hand around. Two hands around by the right. Go side O, here you go. Head couple, sashay down, come on back. Head couple, right arm around, once and a half. Left to the next person in the line, right to your partner, always. Half turn when you get to the bottom of the line. Sashay back. Everybody step in. Cast off. Everybody through that London Bridge.
My father and my grandmother raised me up on stories of the war, told me about so much about the veterans, what this one said and that one said and the other one said, and showed me what happened locally near where I live, and it made it seem so real to me that as I got older I began to admire those people and began to realize I could never do what they did. That's why I admire them. I'm here trying to pay honor to them. Much as you go to a cemetery and lay flowers, I'm here to pay honor to those people. I can't do anything really. I'm just paying honor to those people that so richly deserve it.
It's the best thing. We come out here and live history, and I don't think there's I love history since I was a kid, and to come out and live it, there's nothing better. I mean, we try to get as close to the men that fought this war as we can, and it's like we get moments.
And I, have talked to Confederate veterans. I was in the last Confederate reunion in 1951. I don't know whether I really should relate this story, for public consumption or not, but I walked up to the most coherent one of the 4 or 5 that were there, and was kind of afraid of him because I was just 15 years old. I was in the National Guard, and I said, "Sir, what advice could you give a young fellow like me?" And I was expecting some great wisdom, And he said, "Son, I tell you, go out with all the women you can while you're young, because when you get my age, you can't."
I want the spectators that showed up by the thousands here to go home, so that the kids that are really just wet cement, which kids are before they form what they want to do and how they want to learn, I want them to go to libraries. I want them to ask questions. I want them to ask their teacher about reading lists, and I want them to have seen the first chapter of a book, and I want them to go out and read the rest of the book. And that's what living history is all about. And that's why I, the committee, people put this on, every guy that's now trying to get to his car, what we do. It's what we do best, and it's what we love the best. And words, at this point in time, kind of fail me. And I'm really tired. And thanks for really coming. So everybody's gonna, if they watch this, thank you.